Welcome to Web Development Lesson 2.5. In this lesson, we're going to cover pseudo-classes, which is another layer you can add to your selectors to more precisely target elements on your web page. In addition to pseudo-classes, we're going to cover these four CSS properties because they're unique and they offer some capabilities that can work well with pseudo-classes. So let's get to it. So as was mentioned just now, pseudo-classes is another layer of selecting in terms of specifying a CSS rule. The most famous one is the hover, which allows you to do this type of trick effect that when you hover over an element, perhaps you could change its background color. And you'll see this a lot with nav bars. You can see up here, that is the hover pseudo-class. In addition to this, there's others. There's a whole list of different pseudo-classes. There's pseudo-classes that deal with hyperlinks. I'm going to scroll down a little bit more. This pseudo-class is an interesting one. It lets you target the first element inside of another element. Again, these pseudo-classes help to, select elements without necessarily having to introduce a class name. Which seems to be the very common, easy way to select a group of elements and apply CSS to that. So let's go over to our replit and let's look at the example we have. So we already have some CSS applied and we'll review that CSS. But let's look at the HTML first. So here we have a hyperlink. We made it look like a button by just doing a little CSS. We have a horizontal rule. You can see it looks a little thicker than your normal horizontal rule, so we'll talk about that. We have a div with a bunch of links, possibly to replicate a nav bar. Here is another div, and we gave it a class name of gallery. And again, we have pictures of 4 games from PlayStation 5. And you'll notice that they're all grayed out. We'll talk about that CSS in a little bit. And at the very end, we have another div called links, which has a picture and has the word Facebook. Has another picture and has the word GitHub. But when you look at the preview, you don't see the words. So the trick here will be for us to be able to get the words to display when you hover over maybe the icon. Okay, and that's the goal for today. We're going to explore the hover pseudo-class. So let's go over to CSS. So the first thing you notice is that we changed the font of all the text on the page to Arial by using the body element. The horizontal rule, we made it a little thicker by simply changing its height. We also gave it a color. So this is the first one we want to kind of target. And let's read the scenario. So we want to change the background color of the horizontal rule when you place your mouse over it. When you see something like this, that should give you an indication that you're using the hover pseudo-class. But the first thing that has to be specified is that you're hovering over the horizontal rule. So we're going to specify horizontal rule, hover. That is how you use the hover pseudo-class. You specify the element and then you put hover. And this reads as when you hover over the horizontal rule, apply this CSS. And let's simply maybe change the background color to red. Let's run it and let's see what happens. So notice when I put my mouse over it, it changes to red. Now, being that the web page is very kind of like black, white, gray, to see red now attracts your vision, your eyes to that particular spot. Again, that's what the hover pseudo-class does for you. It lets you change the styling in order to draw the person's attention to a particular element. Okay, I'm not quite sure why you would want to draw attention to the horizontal rule, but it was an easy example for us to use. Now let's do something a little more practical. So this click me button, let's change the background color. So when you place your mouse over the element with an ID of click me, so here you go, ID of click me. So that is this. And because it we saw this line of when you place your mouse over it, that gives us the indication of hover. And that's it. So notice, using the hover pseudo-class is not hard. You still do your normal selectors. You just, tack on the colon hover at the end. Honestly, that's how all the pseudo-classes work. You simply put the colon and then the pseudo-class that you want to apply to it. And let's change the background color to this. And let's say it was blue. So let's do blue. Let's run it. And that's a nice effect. I mean, you've seen this in plenty of websites, that when you put your mouse over a button, the color changes. So let's practice that again with the nav bar. Because again, typically when you use a nav bar, the links, something will happen with the links to let you know that you're hovering over it. So when the user hovers over a link inside an element with an ID of nav. So you really got to break this up. Don't let this part hang you up. This is just a hover. So now you got to go back to your normal way of selecting stuff. Know that this is a descendant selector. So first we're going to do nav, and a hyperlink is an A. And because we want to hover over the hyperlink, we do this. Now I will tell you, a good portion of the times when you're doing a hover, you most likely have the regular styling of the element preceding it. So you can see here, you could kind of take the cue off of this, that this was the hyperlinks inside of an element with an ID of nav. Well, all you're going to do is stick the hover at the end of it. And let's see, what are we doing? We're changing the color to it. So let's change the color to yellow. Let's run it. And now we got this. So when I hover over the link changes yellow. Okay? So again, a lot of interaction now. I want to do something with these links and also with the button. Because now that we're using hyperlinks in a slightly different way, I mean, they're still hyperlinks. We're still hyperlinking to something. But because we're masking them in terms of a button, a nav bar, this line kind of seems out of place. So one of the CSS properties that we talked about at the beginning was text decoration. So what we can do is, let's do A. So you can say, change the text decoration of all hyperlinks to none. So this is just a regular element selector. That is the hyperlinks. And we're going to write text decoration none. So text decoration none means the hyperlink is not going to be decorated. There's no underline, none of that stuff. And now this looks better. Look at the button. Without the line, kind of feels like a button. The nav bar without the line kind of feels like a nav bar. So again, just one of the CSS properties you may want to use when creating nav bars or creating buttons. Again, we're going to use hyperlinks, but we don't want that extra baggage of the underline with the hyperlinks. Okay, so another property, CSS property that's really cool is this filter business. So filter allows you to do many different things. And I'm going to switch over to W3 Schools for a second. So you can do stuff with blurs, opacity, inverse, saturate, sepia. That's a cool one. Kind of does like an old yellowish country style filter on the image. Again, I'll leave this more for you to explore. But we've chosen the grayscale with a grayscale of 100, which means they're completely gray. So let's look at our next scenario. So we want to remove the filter from the image inside an element with a class of gallery. So another descendant selector. And like I mentioned, if you look up top, we already have the descendant selector there. The only thing we're going to tack onto it is when the user moves their mouse over the image. All right. So that's your hover. Okay. So, and I wanted to mention this up here. I might have gone over too fast. With a descendant selector, the hover pseudo class goes at the end, not in the middle. Goes at the end. So we want to remove the filter. So we're going to put filter And this is one of the cool things about using an IDE. It kind of gives you some hints. So you can see here, to remove it, you could put none. And that will take off the grayscale. So let's see what that looks like. So we can see here when I put my mouse over it, notice how the color comes back? I can make this a little bigger so you can see better. So that is a nice effect too. And there's all different types of filters you can do to kind of draw attention to what the person is hovering over. All right, so let's kind of go on to the last one. So we have these two divs down here that are inside of an element with links. So let's see, it says change the width of the containers inside an element with an ID of links. So again, as I mentioned, most likely you're going to have the base selector up front, and you're just going to stick the hover afterwards. So notice the width of this is 20px, which means that you're limiting the size of it. Now, normally when you limit the size of a div, anything that's inside is going to kick over to the next line. Well, that's where this property comes in, the overflow. Overflow hidden means that anything that goes outside of this box area that's specified by the width and the height is hidden, which is a neat trick because now we don't see the words. But we do want to see the words when we hover over the icon, and that's what this is doing. So when I hover over the div, I'm going to change the width to 200px. Let's run it. Let's go down a little bit. And there you go. So it kind of has the illusion that the words are popping up next to it, but really all it is that we're changing the width of the container to allow us to see the words. The words were always there. It's just that they were hidden. So if you kind of saw, I mean, this is hover pseudo-class is awesome. You could definitely add a lot of interactivity. Just make sure that the hover is being used to draw attention to what you want. I would say excessive use of the hover can also distract because as you're moving your mouse over your web page, things are changing all over the place. So you don't want to have the person experience that either. You want to target specifically things that you want to draw attention to. Now there is one more property I want to cover, and that's called transition. That's a nice one. And I'm going to apply it to everything. So I'm going to use the asterisk. And let's do 1 second. And then for this, I think I may actually pop it over into a new page. And all right, so what I want you to see is, and let me make sure I run it. And let me refresh it here. I don't know if you kind of spotted it. Let me do it again. So let me take my mouse off of it. Notice how it becomes blue. It's not instantaneous. So it's almost like a fading. What the transition property does is that it will apply your CSS over the course of a second. So it might be interesting to see this one. Well, this one actually just popped. But there is a way to kind of make this look as though it's growing. But the CSS, that transition is nice. I mean, we can increase it to 2, but at that point it might end up being too slow. So let's run it again. Let's go here, refresh. And this is 2 seconds. So notice it takes 2 seconds for it to get to blue. When I take my mouse over, it takes 2 seconds to get to black. Same thing with all of these. Again, I think most people, when you get to interacting website, they don't want to wait 2 seconds to see something happen. It needs to be instantaneous. Again, that's up to you. You got to figure out what you're using that transition for. So let's get back to our presentation. So in this lesson, we covered the hover pseudo-class. There's many different pseudo-classes, which again provide another layer to the way you can select elements on your web page. But the hover one is cool because it's an effect that happens when you hover over a particular element. We reviewed some CSS properties that allow us to change the way hyperlinks look, the way images look, the way divs look. And then lastly, we covered the transition property, which kind of times the CSS effects when they get changed from one to the other, which is excellent when it comes to the hover pseudo-class. So hopefully you're excited about playing around with the hover pseudo-class. It is a lot of fun. Enjoy.